The groan of the wheels was the only sermon this land offered, a long, grinding prayer of iron on iron that spoke of distance and futility. Outside the slat window of the last car, the world was a study in beige and brown, a canvas bleached by a sun that had no mercy and baked by a God who had long since turned his face away. Dust, fine as powdered bone, found its way through every crack in the cheap pine siding, coating the tongue, stinging the eyes, and settling like a shroud on the souls of the few who occupied the car. It was the dust of forgotten dreams and futures that had shriveled on the vine before they ever had a chance to ripen. This was the part of the train for things and people that didn't matter. Sacks of flour that smelled of weevils, a crate of chickens that had fallen silent hours ago, and a handful of passengers who couldn't afford a proper seat in the forward cars. They were ghosts in transit, their face etched with the same weary resignation as the landscape scrolling past. Among them, a new ghost had just appeared. Her name was Ellie, and she was 18 years old, though the number felt like a lie. 18 was supposed to be the start of things, a door swinging open. For her. It had been a cage door slamming shut. She moved with the hesitant, twitching caution of a rabbit that has felt the shadow of a hawk pass over it one too many times. Her dress, a calico of some faded blue pattern, was ripped at the hem and stained with the grime of hard travel. One of the buttons at her throat was missing, and she kept pulling the collar closed with a hand that was raw and chapped, the nails broken down to the quick. She had scrambled onto this last car at the water stop a few miles back, a desperate, graceless climb that had scraped her knees and cost her the last of her breath. She didn't have a ticket. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a knot of terror in her belly so tight it felt like a stone she had swallowed. Every clatter of the train, every shout from a distant brakeman, sent a jolt through her thin frame. She was running from a man she was supposed to call husband, a title he'd bought from her father for the price of a few dozen bottles of cheap whiskey and a promise to cancel a debt. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, a greasy, possessive thing that had stripped her bare long before his hands ever could. That was the marriage she was fleeing, not a union, but an ownership, a branding. She huddled in the corner farthest from the door, trying to make herself small, to fold into the shadows and become just another sack of unwanted cargo. Her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, scanned the other passengers. There were a few families, their faces gaunt with failed hopes, clutching ragged children who were too exhausted to cry. There was a man in a dusty bowler hat, his face slick with sweat, who kept glancing at her with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. She turned away from him, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were all just different kinds of traps. And then there was him. He sat alone on the opposite side of the car, a world away from everyone else. He was a tall man, built of long lines and hard angles, his shoulders broad enough to block out the harsh light from the window behind him. He wore a canvas duster the color of the earth, worn thin at the elbows and dark with sweat and trail dust. A low-brimmed hat, stained and misshapen by sun and rain, shadowed his face, leaving only his jaw and the hard line of his mouth visible. He wasn't moving, while the rest of the cars swayed and jostled with the train's rough rhythm. He seemed perfectly still, an anchor in the shifting sea of misery. His name was Silas Boone, though she had no way of knowing that. Names were a luxury out here. What mattered was what a man was. And this man was quiet, a dangerous kind of quiet. It wasn't the peace of a man at ease with the world. It was the stillness of a boulder that has been sitting in the same spot for 1,000 years, indifferent to the wind and the rain. He expected nothing, and he offered nothing. His hands, which rested on his knees, were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were capable hands, the kind that could fix a fence, break a horse, or end a life with the same detached efficiency. But it was his eyes, when he briefly lifted his head to the sound of a distant whistle, that held her. They weren't cruel or kind, they were empty. It was an emptiness that went bone deep, a hollowed-out look of a man who had seen everything the world had to offer and had found it all wanting. The fire had gone out long ago, leaving behind only gray ash. He looked at the other passengers not as people, but as obstacles, pieces of the landscape to be navigated and ignored. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And for some reason that she couldn't name, that made him seem safe. The train began to slow again, its whistle screaming a mournful cry as it approached another sun-blasted settlement that was little more than a station house and a water tower. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ellie's exhaustion. This was where they would be looking for her. The men her husband had sent, men who worked for him, drank with him, men who saw her as a piece of property that had slipped its leash. She pressed herself deeper into the corner, her breath catching in her throat. Through the slats, she saw two figures on the platform, their silhouettes stark against the blinding glare. They were thick-set men with the lazy, confident posture of bullies. One of them spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the parched ground and scanned the cars, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately. Ellie's blood ran cold. She had nowhere to go. To jump from the train now would be to break a leg, if not her neck. To stay was to be caught, to be dragged back to that suffocating room above the saloon, to the fate that was worse than any death she could imagine. Her frantic gaze swept the car one last time. The families would offer no help. They had their own troubles. The man in the bowler hat would likely be the first to sell her out for a silver dollar. And then her eyes landed back on the cowboy, on Silas Boone. He was a wall, an unreadable, unmoving wall of a man. He hadn't even looked toward the window. The goings-on of the world outside were of no concern to him. He was a void. And right now, a void was the only place she could think to hide. Making a decision born of pure, animal terror, she pushed herself up on trembling legs. The floorboard swayed beneath her feet. She moved across the car, a small, desperate wraith gliding through the dust motes. She stopped before him, her shadow falling over his worn boots. He didn't look up immediately. He seemed to sense her presence rather than see it, the way a horse senses a fly before it lands. Slowly, with a weariness that seemed to pull on every muscle, he tilted his head back. His hat shifted, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were just as she'd thought, gray and empty as a winter sky. They held no judgment, no curiosity, no pity. They just were. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked whisper, barely more than a breath of sound. "Mr.?" she began, her throat so tight the word was a painful rasp. He said nothing. He just watched her, his expression unchanging. She had to force the next words out. It was the most insane, most intimate, most hopeless plea she could imagine. It was a request that could get her slapped, or laughed at, or worse. But the sound of heavy boots stepping onto the connecting platform behind her stole her choice. "Please," she whispered, her eyes pleading with an intensity that should have set the very air on fire. "They're coming for me." She took a ragged breath. Can I hide under your coat?" She made sure he could see her hands, held open and empty at her sides. She made sure her gaze was direct, stripped of any feminine wile or suggestion. This was not a proposition. It was a prayer for obliteration, a plea to be made invisible. She was asking for shelter, not from the sun or the rain, but from other men. Silas Boone looked at her for a long moment. An eternity seemed to pass in the space between heartbeats. He saw the raw terror in her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the hunted look of a creature run to ground. He saw the torn dress and the thin shoulders. He saw it all, and his face remained a mask of stone. He looked past her, toward the open doorway where the heavy footsteps were now entering their car. He did not speak, he did not nod. He simply lifted the left side of his heavy canvas duster. The gesture was small, economical, and utterly profound. It created a dark, triangular cave of shadow and worn fabric. It was an invitation without warmth, a sanctuary without promise. It was enough. Without a second of hesitation, Ellie scrambled forward on her knees and slipped into the space he had made. She curled herself into a tight ball on the gritty floor, her side pressed against the hard muscle of his thigh, her head tucked down. The thick canvas fell over her like a collapsing tent, plunging her into a world of near-total darkness. The air smelled of trail dust, old leather, horse, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. The world outside vanished. All she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart, the rhythmic creak of the train car, and the heavy, solid presence of the man who now concealed her. He shifted his weight slightly, and the coat settled more fully around her. A final, silent act of concealment. She was hidden. She was safe, if only for a moment. Heavy boots slammed onto the wooden floor of the car, a sound as final and percussive as a coffin nail being hammered home. Ellie, curled in her dark sanctuary, flinched violently. The vibrations traveled up through Silas's leg and into her body. The scent of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey invaded her refuge, a smell she knew all too well. It was the smell of the man she was supposed to marry, the smell of the room she had fled. "We're looking for a girl." The voice was gravelly, accustomed to being obeyed. It was Jed, his tone thick with impatience and the casual cruelty of a man who enjoys his work. Ran off from her husband, about so high, brown hair, looking like a half-drowned cat. A second voice, higher and meaner, chimed in. "Hank, ain't a soul on this train ain't seen her. She's property of Mr. Abernathy. There's a reward." The word property sent a fresh wave of ice through Ellie's veins. She pressed her face against the rough denim of Silas's trousers, trying to stop the sob that was clawing its way up her throat. From her limited vantage point, she could see the dusty boots of the two men as they moved through the car. She heard the frightened murmurings of the other passengers, the shushing of a crying child. No one would help. The reward was a promise. Crossing these men was a threat. The boots stopped directly in front of them, directly in front of Silas. "And what about you?" Friend Jed's voice was closer now, laced with suspicion. "You ain't seen nothing, sitting here in the dark like a damned owl." Ellie held her breath. She could feel the stillness in the man beside her, a complete and total lack of tension. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He was nothing. He was a rock in the middle of a stream, and the water was just flowing around him. There was a long silence. The creaking of the train filled the void. Finally. Silas shifted his weight, just enough for the leather of his gun belt to creak. It was not a threat, merely a statement of fact. A low sound rumbled from his chest, barely a word. "No." "No," Hank's voice was mocking. "Just know you're a talkative fella, ain't you? What you got under that coat? A jug, a dog." The toe of a boot nudged the edge of Silas's duster, inches from Ellie's head. A tremor of pure terror shot through her. It was over. They would find her, and they would drag her back. And the quiet man who had offered her a moment's shelter would be beaten or killed for his trouble. She felt a change in him then. It was subtle, a gathering of energy in the muscles of his leg, a slight tensing of his entire frame. It was the feeling of a rope being pulled taut just before it snaps. Jed must have sensed it too. His voice turned sharp. "Leave him be. Hank, he's just some broke trail hand. Let's check the next car." She couldn't have gone far. The boots moved away. Ellie's body went limp with a relief so profound it was painful. She heard them questioning the family across the aisle, their voices fading slightly. They were moving on. She had a few more seconds of life. Then she felt a hand, his hand, press firmly against her back. It wasn't gentle, it was commanding. Through the thick fabric of the coat, a single, guttural word reached her ears, spoken so low it was more a vibration than a sound. "Hold." Before she could process the command, the world erupted. In one fluid, violent motion. Silas was on his feet, pulling her with him. The coat fell away, and the harsh light of the doorway was a physical blow. She had a fleeting, chaotic impression of the shocked faces of the other passengers, of Jed and Hank turning, their mouths open in surprise. Silas didn't hesitate. He had her wrist in an iron grip, and he took 2 powerful strides toward the open freight door. The ground was a rushing, blurred ribbon of brown and gray. The wind tore at her hair and screamed in her ears. He didn't slow down. He didn't prepare. He simply launched them both into the void. For a heartbeat, there was only air. Then the ground met them with the force of a battering ram. Pain was a white-hot explosion in her side and shoulder. They tumbled through gravel and thorny scrub, a tangle of limbs and desperation. Silas had twisted in midair, ensuring he took the brunt of the impact. His body slammed into hers, shielding her head with his arm as they rolled. The world a dizzying, sickening cartwheel of sky and earth. They came to a stop in a cloud of their own dust, every inch of Ellie's body screaming in protest. The air was gone from her lungs, replaced by a raw, burning agony. She lay gasping, trying to pull breath into a body that refused to cooperate. Silas was already moving. He was on one knee, his face a mask of pure, feral focus. He hauled her to her feet, his grip on her arm the only thing keeping her from collapsing. A sharp crack echoed across the plain, followed by the high-pitched whine of a bullet slicing the air just past her ear. "Move!" His voice was a rasp, a raw command that cut through her shock. And they ran. It was not a graceful flight. It was a stumbling, desperate scramble for survival. The train was already shrinking in the distance, but 2 figures had leaped from it, landing more skillfully than they had. Jed and Hank. A 3rd man was untying horses from a post back at the station. They would be mounted and after them in minutes. The desert was a furnace. The sun beat down on them, relentless and cruel. The ground was uneven, littered with loose rocks that turned under their feet and sharp-edged stones that tore at the thin soles of Ellie's shoes. There was no cover. They were 2 small, exposed figures in a vast, indifferent wilderness, and death was coming for them on horseback. Silas ran with a long, ground-eating stride, pulling her along. He never looked back. His focus was entirely forward, his empty eyes scanning the horizon, searching for something she couldn't see. Her lungs burned as if she'd inhaled hot coals. A sharp pain stitched her side, and her legs felt like lead. She stumbled, her ankle twisting, and went down hard on her knees. "I can't," she gasped, the words choked with dust and despair. He didn't stop. He turned and hauled her back to her feet with a single, powerful tug, his fingers digging into her arm. He didn't offer a word of encouragement or comfort. He simply pointed with his chin toward a low, shimmering line of broken hills in the distance. "There," he grunted, and started running again, forcing her to keep pace. It was a nightmare of heat, dust, and ragged breathing. The only sounds were the frantic pounding of their own hearts, the scrape of their feet on the gravel, and a new sound, a terrible rhythm that grew steadily louder, the drumming of horse hooves. They were closing. Ellie risked a glance over her shoulder. The riders were visible now, 2 dark shapes growing larger, their figures distorted by the heat haze rising from the desert floor. They were gaining fast, their fresh horses eating up the distance with terrifying speed. Panic, stark and absolute, threatened to swallow her whole. Her legs wanted to give out, to simply stop and accept the inevitable. But then she looked at the man beside her. Silas's face was set like granite. Sweat cut clean channels through the grime on his cheeks. A dark, wet patch was spreading on the sleeve of his duster, just below the shoulder. Blood. He must have been hit by that first shot, or cut badly in the fall. He didn't slow. He didn't acknowledge the pain. He just kept moving forward, his will a tangible force pulling her along with him. Something inside her shifted. The whimpering terror receded, replaced by a hard, defiant spark. She had not come this far, run this hard, only to be dragged back like a stray calf. She focused on the back of Silas's boots, on the rhythm of his stride. She matched him step for step. Her own pain and fear burned away by the sheer, primal need to live. The hoofbeats were deafening now. A shot rang out, closer this time, kicking up a spray of dirt just ahead of them. The hills were so close, a sanctuary of stone and shadow. They were running up a slight incline, the loose scree sliding under their feet. Silas suddenly veered left, yanking her with him. He had spotted what he was looking for, a narrow wash, a deep, dry scar carved into the earth by ancient floodwaters. It was a ditch, no more than 10 feet deep, but it was their only chance. Now, he yelled, and they half ran, half fell down the steep, sandy bank. They landed in a heap at the bottom as another bullet sang over their heads. The wash provided immediate cover. It twisted and turned, its high banks blocking the view from the plains above. Silas didn't pause. He grabbed her hand, his palm rough and calloused against hers, and they plunged deeper into the winding channel. The sound of the horses grew louder, then passed directly overhead. They froze, pressing themselves against the crumbling dirt wall. Ellie could hear the horses snorting and stamping, the low curses of their riders. They went in here somewhere. Jed's voice was a frustrated roar from just above them. Fan out Findham Abernathy wants the girl alive. The man, he don't care about. They waited, motionless, their breath held tight in their chests. For an eternity. The only sounds were the wind and the nervous shifting of the horses. Then, the hoofbeats moved away, splitting up as the men began to search the labyrinth of washes and ravines. Only when the sounds had faded into the distance did Silas move. He sagged against the wall, his head bowed, his chest heaving. Ellie slid down to the ground, her legs finally giving out. She was shaking uncontrollably, her body seized by the aftershocks of terror. They were alive, for now. She looked at him. The blood on his sleeve was darker now, a significant stain against the tan canvas. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the fabric near the wound. He flinched, not from pain, but from the unexpected contact. His gray eyes met hers, and for the first time, they held something other than emptiness. It was a flicker of surprise, a glint of shared survival. They had not spoken more than 3 words to each other. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. He had no reason to help her, and she had no reason to trust him. Yet, in the silent, sun-baked belly of the earth, caked in dust and sweat and blood, a fragile thread had been spun between them. It was a trust born not of words or promises, but of a shared flight, a shared enemy, and the desperate, unifying instinct to draw one more breath in a world that was trying its damnedest to choke them out. The silence that followed their escape was a different kind of quiet. It was not the stillness of peace, but the hollow, ringing silence of a world that had been emptied of immediate threat. For a long time, they remained at the bottom of the wash, listening. The only sounds were the rasp of their own breathing and the soft whisper of the wind over the lip of the ravine. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. Silas was the first to move. He pushed himself away from the dirt wall with a quiet grunt, the movement stiff. He tore a strip of fabric from the bottom of his shirt, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet, and began to wrap it tightly around his bleeding arm. He worked with a detached, practical air, as if he were mending a piece of tack rather than his own flesh. He never asked for help, and Ellie, watching him with wide, exhausted eyes, knew better than to offer it. When he was done, he looked at her. His gray eyes held no softness, but the raw edge of hostility was gone, replaced by a flat, pragmatic assessment. "We walk," he said. The 2 words were a sentence, a plan, and a command all in one. He started down the winding wash without looking back to see if she was following. She knew he wouldn't. She was a choice he had made in an instant, and now he was living with the consequences. Whether she could keep up was her problem, not his. Pushing herself up on aching limbs, her body a constellation of bruises and scrapes, she followed him. They walked for hours. The sun disappeared, and a vast, cold canopy of stars glittered overhead, offering no warmth, only a faint, ghostly light to see by. The desert at night was a different beast. The heat of the day bled away into a profound chill that seeped into their bones. The world was stripped of color, rendered in shades of black and silver. The silence deepened, broken only by the cry of a distant coyote and the crunch of their boots on the gravelly floor of the wash. Silas moved with a steady, relentless pace. He knew this land. He read the turns of the ravines and the shapes of the rocks as if they were pages in a familiar book. He was a part of this harsh, unforgiving landscape. And she was an intruder. Every step was an agony. Her cheap shoes were falling apart, and she could feel blisters forming on her heels. The terror of the chase had given way to a deep, profound exhaustion that was so complete it felt like a sickness. More than once, she stumbled, her vision swimming, but she never fell. She would look up at the dark, straight line of his back moving ahead of her, a solitary, unyielding silhouette against the stars, and she would force her legs to keep moving. He was her only direction, her only hope. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that she would simply lie down in the sand and let the desert take her, he stopped. He had led them out of the wash and up a gentle rise. Before them, nestled in a shallow basin and barely visible in the starlight, was a shape. It was a small, dark block against the horizon, with a second, smaller block beside it, a homestead. It was not a welcoming sight. There were no lights in the windows, no smoke curling from the chimney. The place seemed as silent and abandoned as the rest of the desert. The main structure was a small cabin of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud that had cracked and fallen away in places. The roof of the porch sagged at one corner, and a nearby corral fence was leaning precariously. Beside it stood a small, sturdy barn that seemed in slightly better repair. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort, and it looked as weary and beaten as she felt. Silas led the way to the cabin door. He didn't knock. He simply lifted the latch and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest. The air that drifted out was cool and smelled of dry wood, dust, and something else, something faintly human. He stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed him, crossing the threshold into a new and uncertain chapter of her life. The inside was a single room, dark and Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough plank table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A cot was pushed against the far wall, and shelves holding a few tins and sacks of flour lined another. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. And it was not empty. Sitting at the table, a tin cup held in 2 small hands, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and eyes that were too big and too serious for his small face. He wore a patched shirt that was too big for him and regarded them with a solemn, unblinking stare. He showed no surprise, no fear. He just watched, a small, silent sentinel in the dark. Silas walked past the boy and went to a water barrel in the corner, scooping out a ladleful of water. He drank deeply, then offered the ladle to Ellie. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it, but the cool water was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The boy's gaze shifted to her, taking in her torn dress, her wild hair, her bruised face. He looked at Silas, then back at her. A silent question passed between them, a conversation held in a language she did not understand. Silas gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, and the boy, Tom, seemed to accept this. He turned his attention back to his tin cup. Silas lit a single kerosene lamp, and the small room was filled with a warm, flickering light that made the shadows dance. He gestured toward a narrow door she hadn't noticed before. "In there," he said. The room was little more than a closet, just big enough for a narrow bed with a thin mattress stuffed with straw and a single, threadbare blanket, a small window, covered by a piece of burlap. looked out onto the dark plain. There was nothing else. It was a cell, but after what she had run from, it felt like a kingdom. She sank down onto the mattress, the straw rustling beneath her, and was asleep before she even had a chance to pull the blanket over her. She woke to the sound of a rooster crowing, a sound so normal and domestic it was jarring. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the past day came rushing back, and she sat up, her heart pounding. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the burlap window covering. The ranch was quiet. She crept out of her room. The main cabin was empty. Silas and the boy were gone. A profound sense of dislocation washed over her. She was a ghost in this silent house, a piece of driftwood washed up on an unfamiliar shore. She had no right to be here, no purpose. The thought of being sent away, of being cast back out into that harsh wilderness, was more terrifying than the memory of Jed and Hank. She had to do something. She had to earn her place, even if that place was only for a single day. She found a worn broom leaning in a corner and began to sweep the floor. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was sweeping a floor. With each stroke, she felt as if she were clearing away not just the dust, but a small piece of her own fear. She moved to the crude kitchen area. The supplies were meager: a sack of flour, another of beans, some dried salt pork, a few shriveled potatoes in a bin. She built up the fire from the glowing embers in the hearth and put a pot of water on to boil. Her hands, accustomed only to mending and needlework, were clumsy and unsure, but she worked with a desperate focus. She made a thin stew from beans and a small piece of the pork, and a batch of lumpy, uneven biscuits. It wasn't much, but it was food. It was an offering. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Ellie learned that Silas and Tom rose before the sun, worked the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the barn, and tended to the 2 bony cows and handful of chickens that constituted the ranch's livestock. She took over the inside of the cabin. It became her domain. She cooked and cleaned, washed their clothes in a bucket with harsh lye soap, and mended the tears in their shirts with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box. Her fear did not vanish, but it changed. It receded from a constant, screaming panic to a low, persistent hum in the back of her mind. She found herself watching the horizon, scanning the vast emptiness for any sign of riders. But the days remained empty and quiet, filled only with the sun and the wind. The silence of the ranch was the most profound thing she had ever known. Tom rarely spoke, communicating with Silas through looks and gestures, and Silas himself was a creature of absolute silence. He never asked her about her past. He never asked her why she was running or who was chasing her. He never spoke of the future, of how long she could stay, or what would become of her. They existed together in a state of suspended reality, their lives governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the endless list of chores required to simply exist in this place. But in his silence, there were actions. One afternoon, she was scrubbing the floor, the heat of the day oppressive inside the small cabin. Sweat dripped from her forehead and her back ached. She felt a wave of dizziness and sat back on her heels, pressing a hand to her head. When she opened her eyes, a tin cup of cool water was sitting on the floor beside her. She looked up. Silas was halfway out the door, his back to her. He hadn't said a word. He had just seen a need and met it. Her little room was her sanctuary, but the wooden door had a high, piercing squeak that grated on her nerves every time she opened or closed it. It was a small thing, but it was a constant reminder of the state of decay, of the fragility of her refuge. One morning, she woke and opened the door, and it swung silently on its hinges. She looked closely and saw a dark smudge of axle grease carefully applied to the rusted metal. He must have done it while she was asleep. The wind was a constant companion on the plains, a mournful, ceaseless voice that rattled the windows and seeped through the cracks in the walls. One evening, it rose to a gale, howling around the small cabin like a hungry wolf. The burlap over her window flapped and snapped, and the ill-fitting wooden frame shuddered in its casement. She lay in her bed, listening to it, feeling as exposed and vulnerable as the cabin itself. The next afternoon, she noticed he had nailed a new strap of leather to the wall beside the window. Before he and Tom left for the barn, he paused, reached into her room, and without a word, looped the strap over a nail on the window frame, securing it tightly against the coming night's wind. These were not grand gestures. They were not words of comfort or promises of protection. They were small, practical acts of care, delivered in silence. He had mended a door, quieted a noise that disturbed her peace. He had secured her window, protecting her from the storm. He had left her water when she was weary. Each action was a single, sturdy stitch, quietly mending the torn fabric of her world, creating a fragile sense of safety in the heart of the vast, silent wilderness. The heat of the day had bled out of the land, leaving behind the cool, dry air of a desert night. Outside, the world was a vast, dark ocean of silence, the only sound the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional, lonely cry of a night bird. Inside the small cabin, the kerosene lamp cast a warm, circular glow, a tiny island of light in the immense darkness. It was a fragile piece, one that Ellie had come to cherish with a fierce, protective tenderness. Tom was asleep on his cot in the corner, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of childhood dreams. His presence was a soft, grounding anchor in the quiet room. The day's long work was done. Supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, had been eaten. Now, all that remained was the cleaning of the few tin plates and cups, a final domestic ritual before the cabin surrendered completely to the night. Ellie stood before a wooden basin set on a crate, her hands submerged in the lukewarm, soapy water. The routine of it was comforting. The scrape of the cloth against tin was a small, real sound that kept her tethered to the present moment. The door creaked open and Silas came in, carrying a heavy bucket of water fresh from the well. The scent of cool, damp earth followed him inside. He moved with his usual economy of motion, pouring half the water into the rinse basin and setting the bucket down without a splash. He didn't retreat to the far side of the room as he usually did. Instead, he picked up a piece of clean, rough-spun cloth and stood beside her, waiting. When she placed the first clean, wet plate on the edge of the basin, he took it, his large, calloused fingers sure and steady, and began to dry it. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient partnership. The only sounds were the soft splash of water, the clink of tin, and the breathing of the sleeping boy. It was in moments like these, in the shared, unspoken rhythm of simple tasks, that the wall of silence between them seemed to thinnest. It was a different kind of quiet than the one she had known her whole life. Her father's silences had been heavy and sullen, thick with unspoken resentments and the promise of a drunken rage. The silence of Mr. Abernathy had been a predatory thing, loud with appraisal and ownership. This silence was clean. It was an open space, an emptiness that did not demand to be filled. It simply was. And tonight, for reasons she couldn't name, that open space felt like an invitation, the words that she had locked away in the deepest, darkest cellar of her heart. The story that festered there like a poison began to rise to the surface. Her hands stilled in the water. She stared down at her own reflection, a wavering, distorted face looking back at her from the bottom of the basin. "My PA," she began, her voice so low it was almost lost in the song of the crickets. He wasn't always a mean man. Silas did not stop drying the plate in his hands. He gave no sign that he had hurt her, save for the slightest pause in the circular motion of the cloth. It was enough. "Before my ma passed, he was different. He'd laugh. He taught me how to find water signs in a dry creek bed and how to tell a hawk from a buzzard by the shape of its wings." His hands were gentle then. She looked down at her own hands, chapped and red from lye soap and hard work. They didn't feel like her own, but when she was gone, something inside him broke. The silence in the house was too loud for him, so he started filling it with whiskey. She picked up another plate and began to wash it with a furious, circular motion, scrubbing at a spot that was already clean. The whiskey made the silence go away, but it brought other things, a sour temper, debts. He forgot all the things he'd taught me. He forgot how to laugh. After a while, he forgot he had a daughter. Too, I just became a thing in the house, a thing that cooked his food and mended his shirts. Silas took the clean plate from her and placed it on the stack. He picked up another. His movements were steady, methodical. He was an anchor in the storm of her memory, a solid, unmoving presence beside her. His silence was not an absence of listening. It was a form of it, deep and patient. He owed money to everyone, she continued, her voice gaining a harder edge as the shame and anger she had suppressed for so long began to surface. But he owed the most to Mr. Abernathy, the man who owns the saloon, a big man, with a soft body and hands that always looked damp. He had a way of looking at me when I had to go in there to fetch my PA home. Not the way a man looks at a girl. The way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She was shaking now, a fine tremor that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. She had never spoken these words aloud. They had lived only inside her, a secret sickness. To say them now felt like a betrayal, a violation, but she couldn't stop. One night, my PA came home, happy. It had been years since I'd seen him happy. He was drunk, but it was a cheerful kind of drunk. He told me he'd settled his accounts. He said a respectable man, a man of property, had taken an interest in me, that Mr. Abernathy wanted to make me his wife. He called it a marriage. She let out a short, bitter laugh that was closer to a sob. It wasn't a marriage. It was a bill of sale. I was in the other room, but the walls were thin. I heard it all. I heard the clink of coins on the table. I heard Abernathy say he'd consider the debt paid in full, with a little extra for goodwill. My PA didn't even bargain. He just said, "She's a good girl. She'll do as she's told." Her voice finally broke. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, dropping into the greasy dishwater with a faint hiss. She hung her head, overcome with a shame so profound it felt like it would suffocate her. She had been sold like a piece of livestock, her worth calculated in whiskey and forgiven debts. She waited for Silas's reaction, for a word of pity that would make her feel small, for a question that would force her to relive more of the horror, for him to turn and walk away, disgusted by the ugly truth of her past. He did none of those things. He simply took the last wet cup from the edge of the basin. He dried it with the same deliberate, unhurried care as all the others. His large, rough hand moved with a surprising gentleness over the cheap tin. When he was done, he placed it on the stack with a soft, final clink. The task was finished. He still didn't speak. He took the basin of dirty water and walked to the door, his back to her. He tossed the water out into the night, the sound of the splash loud in the stillness. He came back inside, wiped the basin dry with a cloth, and hung it on its nail on the wall. Chores. Simple, necessary chores. He walked to the hearth and used a long poker to bank the fire, pushing the glowing embers together and covering them with ash so they would last until morning. He was a man tending to his home, a man preparing for another day. Her story, as terrible and life-altering as it was, had not changed the fundamental rhythm of this place. The fire still needed banking. The morning would still come. When he was done, he turned. The lamplight caught the hard planes of his face, the deep lines etched around his eyes. He looked at her, and his gaze was steady, unreadable. There was no pity in it, but for the first time, she thought she saw something in the depths of those empty gray eyes. It wasn't an emotion she could name. It was just a seeing, an acknowledgement. He had heard her story, and he was still standing there. She was still standing there. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of agreement or sympathy. It was a gesture of receipt, message received, understood. Then he turned and walked to the far side of the room where he kept his bedroll, leaving her alone in the circle of lamplight. Ellie stood by the empty basin for a long time, listening to the crickets. The violent trembling inside her had ceased. The terrible weight in her chest felt lighter. She had offered up the ugliest piece of her soul, and it had been accepted without fanfare or judgment. He hadn't tried to fix it. He hadn't offered empty words. He had simply stood with her in her darkness and helped her wash the dishes. She understood then that a man like Silas Boone did not show compassion with words. He showed it with presence. He showed it with action. By not speaking, he had given her the greatest gift imaginable, the dignity of being heard without being pitied. In the quiet, shared space of a simple evening chore, a silent confession had been made and accepted. And in that acceptance, a new kind of silence began to grow between them, one that was not empty, but filled with a deep and unspoken understanding. The confession, once spoken, did not shatter the silence between them. It changed the nature of it. The quiet that had once been a space of cautious neutrality, a truce between two strangers, was now something else entirely. It had become a vessel, a shared space that held the weight of her past and the strength of his acceptance. The ugly truth of her story was now a part of the foundation of their strange, unspoken life. And instead of weakening it, the knowledge seemed to make it stronger, as if a broken bone had been set and was now healing, tougher than it was before. Ellie found herself breathing easier. The constant, gnawing fear of her pursuers had not vanished, but it had loosened its teeth. The vast, empty horizon that had once seemed so threatening now felt like a promise of solitude, a protective barrier. She began to see the land not just as a harsh wilderness to be survived, but as a place with its own fierce, secret beauty. She noticed the way the rising sun first touched the highest peaks of the distant hills, setting them on fire with a soft, rose-colored light. She learned the different voices of the wind, from a low, mournful sigh that whispered through the dry grass to a sharp, keening cry that whipped around the corners of the cabin. Life was hard. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with the earth from the vegetable patch. Her face and arms were tanned by the sun. But this hardship was honest. It was the price of survival, paid with her own effort, and it was 1,000 times better than the soft, suffocating life of ownership that had been planned for her. Here, her sweat and her aches belonged to her. She was tired, but she was free. One afternoon, Silas sent her to clear a tumble of rocks that had fallen and blocked a small spring-fed channel that trickled down from the hills, providing the only water for a patch of stubborn, hardy grazing grass. It was a long walk, and the work was slow and arduous, moving one heavy, sun-warmed rock at a time. As she worked, a flash of impossible color caught her eye. Tucked into a crevice between two large boulders, sheltered from the worst of the wind and sun, was a single wildflower. It was a small, defiant miracle. Its petals were the color of a deep desert twilight, a vibrant, velvety purple that seemed to drink the harsh sunlight and turn it into something beautiful. A tiny, bright yellow center shone like a miniature sun. It grew on a thin, wiry stem, a testament to the ferocious will to live that existed even in this desolate place. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen since she had arrived. She knelt, her work forgotten, and simply looked at it. The flower asked for nothing. It did not apologize for its fragility. It simply existed, a spot of grace in a world of grit. It reminded her of the quiet, unexpected moments of kindness she had found in this place. The cup of water, the silent door, the leather strap on her window. Small, resilient bits of beauty in the harshness. Carefully, she broke the stem near the ground. She held it gently in her palm on the long walk back to the cabin, shielding it from the wind. It felt precious, a secret she had discovered. She did not know what to do with it. To give it to Silas directly felt too bold. too forward. It would be an offering that demanded a response, and she knew he was not a man of easy responses. Words would have to be spoken, and words were not their language. When she reached the homestead, Silas and Tom were in the corral, working with one of the cows. She went to the porch of the cabin. The railing was a single long, sun-bleached log, worn smooth over the years. She laid the small purple flower on the flat, gray wood, placing it in the very center, where no one entering or leaving the cabin could fail to see it. Then, feeling suddenly shy and breathless, she retreated inside. It was not a gift. It was just a thing she had found, a piece of beauty she was leaving behind for the world, or for whoever might notice it. The next morning, she woke early, as she always did. She moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the burlap. The sky was pale gray, the world still waiting for the sun. The cabin door opened, and Silas stepped out onto the porch. He always rose first, to survey the land and the sky, to read the day before it had properly begun. He paused. His usual routine was to walk straight to the edge of the porch, but today he stopped, his gaze fixed on the railing. Ellie held her breath. From her vantage point, she could only see his back, a tall, unmoving silhouette against the growing light. He stood there for a long time, perfectly still. He was looking at the flower. She saw him reach out, his large, work-roughened hand moving with an uncharacteristic hesitation. He did not crush the delicate petals. He picked it up with a surprising gentleness, holding the thin stem between his thumb and forefinger. He brought it closer to his face, studying it in the dawn light. Ellie's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt as exposed as if he were looking directly at her. She expected him to tuck it into the band of his hat, a casual adornment, or to simply let it fall from his fingers, a fleeting curiosity. He did neither. He turned slightly, and she saw him reach into the inner pocket of his canvas duster. He pulled out a small, worn object. It was a book, bound in dark, cracked leather, held shut with a thin strap. It was not a Bible. It was smaller, more personal. She had seen him with it only once or twice, late at night, making notes in it by the dim light of the lamp with a small nub of a pencil. It was a part of his private, silent world, a place she had never imagined seeing inside. With his thumb, he unfastened the strap. He opened the book to a page somewhere in the middle. He carefully, deliberately, laid the small purple wildflower flat against the paper. He held it there for a moment, then gently closed the book over it. He refastened the leather strap, the motion sure and final. He had not just taken the flower, he had preserved it. He had pressed it into the pages of his own private history, making it a permanent part of his solitary life. He tucked the book back into his pocket, gave one last, long look at the horizon, and then walked down the steps to begin the day's work. Ellie sank back from the window, her knees weak. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her washed through her. It was not joy or relief, but a profound, aching sense of being seen. He had understood. He had understood her quiet offering and had answered it with an even quieter acceptance. The gesture was more intimate than a touch, more eloquent than a poem. He had taken the small piece of beauty she had offered and had sheltered it, saved it, made it a part of himself. In that moment, she knew that what was growing between them would never be built with the common materials of the world. They would not speak of affection or whisper promises in the dark. Theirs was a courtship of action, a romance of necessity. Their love story was written in the language of small things. It was in the way she began to take notice of the deep tear in his work glove, and one evening took it while he slept and mended it with small, even stitches, reinforcing the worn leather with a patch from an old piece of her own ruined petticoat. She left it on the table for him to find in the morning, and when he put it on, the fit was snug and strong. He never mentioned it, but she saw him, from a distance, flexing his fingers in the newly mended glove. a slow, thoughtful expression on his face. It was in the way he returned from a long ride in the hills one day and, while unsaddling his horse, quietly placed a rock on the porch railing. It was a piece of rose quartz, veined with milky white, its rough edges worn smooth by time. He didn't give it to her. He just left it there, an object of strange, subtle beauty. And the next day she moved it to the windowsill in her small room, where it caught the morning light. It was in the way she learned that he preferred the charred, crispy edges of the cornbread and started to wordlessly serve him that piece from the skillet. It was in the way he began to split a portion of the firewood into smaller, lighter pieces, leaving it in a separate stack near the door, an unspoken acknowledgement that her arms were not as strong as his for feeding the cabin's hearth. They did not say, "I'm thinking of you." He mended a broken hinge on the chicken coop. She found a way to make a passable stew from a tough jackrabbit he brought home. They did not say, "I care for you." He cleared the path to the well of sharp stones. She used a precious bit of sugar to bake a small, lumpy cake for Tom. And Silas watched, his face unreadable, as the boy's eyes lit up. They were two solitary, wounded people, living on a piece of land that gave no quarter. Words were a luxury they could not afford and did not need. Their trust, their reliance, their growing affection, it was all there, in the silent, daily rhythm of their lives. It was in a mended glove, a smooth stone, a piece of bread, a path made clear. And it had all begun with a single, fragile wildflower, pressed between the pages of a silent man's book, a silent promise to remember. The fragile piece of the homestead was a delicate bubble, and for weeks it had held. The quiet rhythm of their lives had become a comfort so profound that the sharp edges of Ellie's fear had begun to dull. The past was a ghost, and with each sunrise over the silent plains, it seemed to recede a little further, its features blurring, its voice fading. The day the bubble burst began like any other. The sun was a hot, white coin in a vast blue sky. Ellie was hanging washed clothes on a line stretched between the cabin and a sturdy post, the damp fabric snapping in the dry breeze. The clean, soapy scent filled the air. Tom was a few yards away, squatting in the dust, engrossed in a silent, serious game with a collection of smooth stones and a twig. It was a picture of simple, hard-won domesticity, a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. The first sign of wrongness was not a sound, but a silence. The chickens, which had been scratching and clucking contentedly near the barn, suddenly went quiet. A moment later, Silas's horse, tethered near the corral, lifted its head and let out a low, nervous nicker, its ears swiveling toward the low ridge that marked the edge of their basin. Ellie froze, a wet shirt still in her hands. She followed the horse's gaze. For a moment, she saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze rising from the baked earth. Then, the shapes appeared. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bright sky, sitting their horses on the ridge. They were not moving, just watching, surveying. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. It was them. She dropped the shirt. "Tom," she said, her voice a tight, strained whisper. "Come inside, now." The boy looked up, his serious eyes reading the terror on her face. Without a word, he scrambled to his feet and ran to her, his small hand finding hers. She pulled him toward the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She risked one last glance over her shoulder. The riders were moving now, walking their horses slowly, deliberately, down the slope. There was no hurry. They knew they had her. She shoved Tom inside the cabin and slammed the heavy wooden door, dropping the thick bar into place. It felt like a pathetically flimsy defense. The cabin had only 2 small windows, one in her room and one in the main room. She ran to the main window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter Silas had fashioned. She could see them clearly now. Jed and Hank, the same men from the train. Their faces were grimmier, their eyes harder, but she would have known them anywhere. The third man was a stranger, lean and wiry, with a long scar that cut a pale track from his temple to his jaw. They rode with the lazy arrogance of predators who have finally cornered their prey. "Where's Silas?" she whispered to herself, her eyes darting frantically toward the barn. He had gone in there an hour ago to mend a broken harness. He had no idea what was coming. The riders fanned out as they approached, their movements practiced and menacing. They were cutting off any escape. Jed reined in his horse directly in front of the cabin, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Little birds finally come home to roost," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Mister, Abernathy's been awful lonely without you. Ellie, he's eager to welcome you back." Hank and the scarred man dismounted, their spurs jingling, their hands resting on the pistols holstered at their hips. Ellie backed away from the window, pulling a terrified, silent Tom with her. She pressed him into the corner behind the table, trying to shield him with her own body. "Stay here," she breathed. "Don't make a sound." The sound of the barn door creaking open made her head snap around. Silas stepped out into the sunlight, a piece of leather harness in his hand. He blinked, adjusting to the brightness, and then he saw them. He did not look surprised. His body went still, but it was the stillness of a coiled snake, not of shock. He dropped the harness and his hand moved to rest near the butt of his Colt. "You've come a long way for nothing," Silas said, his voice flat and even. Yet it carried a weight that made the air seem to thicken. Jed chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "We ain't here for nothing. We're here for her, and for a little payment for the trouble you caused us back on that train." He gestured with his chin toward Silas. "Take him." Hank and the scarred man started toward Silas, spreading out to approach him from two sides. Silas didn't wait for them to close the distance. He moved with a speed that was shocking in such a large man. He took 2 long strides and met the scarred man head-on. There was a blur of motion, a sharp, brutal crack of bone as Silas's fist connected with the man's jaw. The man went down like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. Hank, seeing his partner fall, drew his pistol, but he was too slow. Silas was already on him, his hand clamping down on Hank's wrist, twisting it with vicious force. The gun clattered to the dust. Silas drove his other fist into Hank's gut, and the man folded with a strangled gasp. From inside the cabin, Ellie watched with a kind of terrified awe. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of controlled, deadly violence. But he had forgotten Jed. As Silas straightened up from disabling Hank, Jed, still on horseback, spurred his mount forward. He had pulled his heavy rifle from its scabbard. He didn't fire it. As the horse lunged past, he swung the rifle like a club. The heavy wooden stock caught Silas squarely on the side of the head with a sickening, hollow thud. Silas staggered, his eyes glazing over. He took one unsteady step, his knees buckling, and then he collapsed face down in the dust, motionless. "No!" The scream was torn from Ellie's throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure despair. Jed swung down from his horse, the rifle still in his hand. Hank was groaning, pulling himself up onto his hands and knees. The scarred man was still out cold. "Stupid," Jed snarled, kicking Silas's unmoving form in the ribs. Should have just stayed out of it. He turned his mean, flat eyes toward the cabin door. "All right, girl, party's over. Come on out. Don't make us burn you out." Silence. Ellie was frozen, her mind a screaming void. The protector was gone. The wall had fallen. There was nothing between her and them now but a thin wooden door. She could feel Tom trembling behind her, his small fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. "I'm gonna count to 3, Jed shouted, his voice losing its lazy edge, replaced by a sharp, angry impatience. 1. The sight of Silas, lying so terribly still in the dirt, broke through her paralysis. The memory of his silent acts of kindness, the water, the mended door, the pressed flower flashed through her mind. He had stood for her. He had fought for her. And now he was broken on the ground because of her. 2. A fire she never knew she possessed ignited in her belly. It was not courage. It was a raw, primal rage, the fury of a cornered mother protecting her young. She looked around the cabin, her eyes wild. Her gaze fell on the wall next to the hearth. Hanging on 2 wooden pegs was Silas's old shotgun, a heavy, double-barreled greener. She had seen him clean it, but she had never seen him fire it. 3. The heavy bar on the cabin door shuddered as a boot slammed against it from the outside. Ellie moved. She flew across the room and lifted the heavy shotgun from its pegs. It was heavier than she could have imagined. The cold steel and oiled wood a terrible, foreign weight in her hands. Her fingers were clumsy on the stock. She fumbled with the brake action, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the latch. The gun fell open, revealing the brass ends of the 2 shells Silas always kept chambered. She snapped it shut. The click echoed in the small room like a death sentence. The cabin door shuddered again, the wood groaning. "Get away from the door, Tom," she commanded, her voice a strange, high-pitched thing she didn't recognize. She backed away, planting her feet, lifting the impossibly heavy weapon to her shoulder. It was awkward, wrong. She leaned the long barrel on the edge of the table to steady it, aiming it squarely at the door. With a final, splintering crack, the wooden bar gave way and the door flew open, slamming against the inside wall. Jed stood there, framed in the bright, unforgiving sunlight, a triumphant sneer on his face. The sneer vanished when he saw her. He froze, his eyes widening at the sight of the twin black holes of the shotgun barrels pointed directly at his chest. Behind him, Hank had gotten to his feet, a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. His eyes were on Tom, cowering in the corner. "Get the boy," Jed hissed, never taking his eyes off Ellie. Hank started forward, a cruel grin spreading across his face as he advanced on Tom. That was the moment. The sight of that man moving toward that child broke the last thread of hesitation in Ellie's mind. She was trembling from head to toe. The world had narrowed to the small metal bead at the end of the barrel, the terrified face of the boy, and the advancing man with the knife. She closed her eyes and pulled one of the triggers. The shotgun erupted with a deafening, apocalyptic roar. The force of the blast was a physical blow, a mule kick of violent energy that slammed back into her shoulder, knocking her off her feet. She fell backward, the heavy gun clattering to the floor. Her ears were ringing. The room filled with a thick, acrid cloud of gray smoke. When she scrambled back up, her shoulders screaming in agony, she saw Hank on the ground, halfway between the door and Tom. He was writhing, a dark, spreading stain blossoming across his chest and stomach. He was not dead, but he was finished. Jed stared at his fallen man, then at Ellie, his face a mask of shocked fury. "You!" he began, raising his rifle. He never finished the word. A second gunshot, sharp and clear, cracked from the side, from the direction of the small, tilled garden patch. Jed's body jerked as if struck by an invisible fist. A small, dark hole appeared on his chest. His eyes went wide with a final, ultimate surprise. He took a single, stumbling step backward, his rifle falling from his grasp, and then he collapsed in the doorway, half in and half out of the cabin. Ellie stared, uncomprehending. Standing near the edge of the corn rows, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel of an ancient-looking hunting rifle, was a man she had only seen from a distance. He was old, his back bent from years of labor, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles under a wide-brimmed straw hat. It was Raul, the quiet, elderly Mexican man who tended the garden and lived in a small adobe shack a quarter-mile away, a man she had thought of as little more than a shadow. He lowered the rifle slowly, his dark, ancient eyes meeting hers. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of grim finality. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a terrible, ringing silence and the wreckage of its passage. Tom let out a choked sob and ran to Ellie. burying his face in her dress. She wrapped her good arm around him, her body shaking uncontrollably, her gaze fixed on the still, silent form of Silas, lying broken in the sun-drenched dirt. The echo of Raoul's rifle shot faded, leaving a silence that was louder and more terrible than the preceding violence. The world seemed to hold its breath. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the still, hot air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, Tom's choked sob broke the spell, and the world came rushing back in a dizzying, sickening wave. Ellie's entire being was focused on the still form in the dust. "Silas!" She stumbled out of the cabin, Tom clinging to her leg, her mind a blank slate of horror. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch, afraid of what she might find. His face was turned to the side, half buried in the dirt, and a dark, ugly bruise was already purpling the side of his head where the rifle stock had connected. A thin trickle of blood ran from his hairline into the dust, turning it a dark, muddy red. "Is he?" she began, her voice a cracked whisper she didn't recognize. Raoul was suddenly there, kneeling on the other side of Silas. The old man's face was grim, his ancient eyes missing nothing. He laid two gnarled fingers against Silas's neck. Ellie watched, her own heart suspended, waiting for the verdict. An eternity passed. "He is breathing," Raoul said, his voice a low rumble, "but it is a shallow breath. We must get him inside." The practical reality of the words was a slap. The bodies of Jed and Hank lay sprawled in the dirt, grotesque monuments to the afternoon's horror. But they were the past. Silas was the present, a fragile, flickering present that had to be protected. Getting him inside was a nightmare of clumsy, desperate effort. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man they had to somehow move. Raoul, though wiry, was old, and Ellie's strength was nearly spent, her shoulder a throbbing agony from the shotgun's recoil. They struggled, half lifting, half dragging him across the yard and over the threshold of the cabin. His boots scraped in the dirt, leaving two long, parallel lines, a testament to his utter helplessness. They managed to get him onto his own cot, which seemed impossibly small for his long frame. He lay utterly still, his breathing a faint, shallow rasp in the quiet room. The ordeal had taken everything they had. Ellie collapsed into a chair, shaking, while Raoul stood breathing heavily, his hands on his knees. The old man's gaze was steady. "The others?" he said, nodding toward the door. "I will take care of them. You take care of him." He went to the hearth, filled the large kettle with water, and set it on the hook over the fire. "Keep the water hot, and pray. Nina, now is the time for prayer." With that, he was gone, leaving Ellie alone with the two silent figures in the room, the sleeping boy and the unconscious man who hovered somewhere between life and death. The first night of the vigil was the longest of her life, as twilight bled into a deep, star-dusted darkness. Ellie began her work. She found clean cloths and, with trembling hands, began to clean the wound on Silas's head. The task was intimate and terrifying. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched him with such purpose. His skin was warm, but it was a dry, unnatural heat that spoke of a growing fever. She bathed his face, wiping away the blood and grime, revealing the strong, harsh lines of his features, now slack and vulnerable in his unconsciousness. The silence of the cabin was a living thing. Every shallow breath he took was a victory. Every long pause between breaths was an eternity of terror. She sat in a wooden chair dragged to his bedside, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, as if she could tether him to the world through her touch alone. She did not sleep. She watched, and she listened, and she prayed. Her prayers were not eloquent. They were a raw, desperate litany of pleas, whispered into the flickering lamplight. "Don't you die, Silas Boone," she murmured, the words a fierce, angry sob. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to save me and then leave me. I won't let you." It was a promise, a threat, a desperate bargain with God and fate and whatever else might be listening in the vast, indifferent darkness. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest. This was her fault. Her past had washed up on the shores of his quiet life and had brought this storm of blood and violence with it. He was lying here, broken, because of her. The next day, a grim, new routine was born. Raoul worked outside, his face a grim mask. He handled the terrible task of dragging the bodies of Jed and Hank far out into the desert, leaving them for the scavengers. He performed the necessary chores of the ranch with a slow, steady determination, keeping their small world from falling into complete ruin. He was the guardian of the outside. The inside belonged to Ellie and Tom. While Ellie tended to Silas, Tom, a small, silent shadow, tried to process the horror in the only way he knew how. He found a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a smooth, flat piece of pine board. He sat in his corner, his small face a mask of concentration. And he began to draw. He drew pictures of Silas, a stick figure with a wide-brimmed hat, standing on top of a lopsided horse, another of Silas mending a fence, another of him standing tall, his arms at his sides. They were crude, childish drawings, but they were powerful talismans. It was the boy's own form of prayer, his own desperate attempt to will the strong man back into existence, to remind the world of who Silas was supposed to be. Ellie's world shrank to the size of the sick room. Time ceased to be a line and became a repeating, agonizing circle. She boiled water, as Raoul had instructed. She tore strips from her own petticoat for fresh bandages. She forced thin, watery broth between Silas's lips with a small spoon, most of it dribbling back out, but some of it getting through. She bathed his feverish skin, trying to cool the heat that was consuming him from within. 2 days passed, then 3. The fever did not break. He thrashed in his cot at times, caught in some dark, violent dream, muttering words she couldn't understand. In those moments, she would hold his hand, her own small hand lost in his, and speak to him in a low, soothing voice. "I'm here, Silas. It's all right. I'm right here." He never responded, but sometimes the thrashing would cease. Hope began to fray. The edges of her world grew dark with exhaustion and despair. She catnapped in the chair, her head falling forward onto the edge of his cot. But she never truly slept. Her own body was a dull, constant ache, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror of the silence from the bed. On the afternoon of the 4th day, a deep, heavy quiet had fallen over the cabin. The sun was slanting low, filling the room with a dusty, golden light. Tom was asleep, his charcoal stick fallen from his limp fingers, a new drawing of Silas lying beside him. Raoul was out in the fields. Ellie was alone with him. She had just finished bathing his face with a cool cloth. The fever seemed to have lessened slightly, but he was so terribly still. She sank back into her chair, the weight of 4 sleepless days and nights pressing down on her. Tears she didn't know she had left began to well in her eyes. "You have to wake up," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief. She reached out and took his hand. It was large, calloused, and utterly limp in hers. "You have to. Tom needs you. This place needs you." Her voice broke. "I need you. You hear me, Silas, I need you. You asked for nothing, and you gave me everything. You can't take it all away now. You can't." She trailed off, her throat closing around a sob. She bowed her head over their joined hands, her tears falling onto his rough, still fingers. This was it, the end of her hope. He was slipping away, and there was nothing more she could do. A faint sound, like a dry leaf scraping on stone, made her lift her head. It was a groan, low and rough. Her head snapped up. His face was turned toward her, and his eyelids were fluttering. She stared, her heart stopping, not daring to breathe. It could have been a twitch, a fever dream. But then, it happened again. Slowly, as if they were lifting a great and impossible weight, his eyelids began to open. The eyes beneath were clouded, unfocused. They stared blankly at the ceiling, then drifted around the room, hazy and uncomprehending. Ellie sat frozen, a statue of terrified hope. Then, his eyes found her. They stopped their aimless wandering and fixed on her face. For a long, silent moment, he just looked at her. The haze seemed to clear, replaced by a dawning recognition. He knew her. He was there. He was back. A sound escaped her, a laugh that was also a sob. The tears that had been tears of grief a moment ago were now tears of overwhelming, impossible relief. They streamed down her face, unchecked. She couldn't speak. She could only smile, a wide, trembling, watery smile of pure, unadulterated joy. And then she felt it. A pressure, faint at first, then stronger. The hand she was holding, the hand that had been limp and lifeless for 4 days, was closing around hers. His fingers, weak but definite, squeezed her own. It was a simple, small movement, but it was a tectonic shift in her universe. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was everything. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. In that single, deliberate act of pressure, he said it all. "I'm here. I'm with you. Thank you." And in her tearful, radiant smile, she answered him in kind. The vigil was over. He had come back. Healing is not a quiet or a gentle thing. It is a brutal, exhausting battle, fought inch by painful inch. Silas's return to consciousness was not a miraculous recovery, but the beginning of a long, arduous climb out of a deep, dark pit. The first days were a disorienting fog of headaches that made him clench his jaw in silent agony, waves of dizziness that left the small cabin tilting and swimming, and a profound weakness that was a constant, humiliating insult to a man whose life had been defined by his own physical strength. He was a terrible patient, not because he complained he never uttered a single word of discomfort, but because of the deep, frustrated rage that simmered in his gray eyes. He hated being helpless. He hated the way his hands trembled when he tried to lift a cup of water, the way the short walk from his cot to the door left him breathless and leaning against the frame for support. Ellie understood this. She saw the war he was waging against his own body and knew that pity was the last thing he needed. She cared for him with the same quiet, practical efficiency she applied to every other task on the homestead. She did not coddle him or coo over him. She simply brought him broth, which he drank with a grim determination. She changed the bandage on his head without a word, her touch gentle but firm. She left a bucket of fresh water and a cloth by his bed so he could wash himself, granting him the dignity of privacy even in his weakened state. Her constant, unobtrusive presence became the new rhythm of his life. He would watch her from his cot as she moved about the cabin, her motions now familiar and sure. He watched her knead dough on the rough-hewn table, a light dusting of flour on her forearms. He watched her mend Tom's shirt, her head bent in concentration, the lamplight catching the soft curve of her neck. He saw the strength in her that had been forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. She was no longer the terrified, half-starved girl from the train. She was a woman who had faced down death and had not flinched, and she had done it for him. The knowledge of this was a heavy, unfamiliar weight in his chest. Tom, seeing that Silas was awake and would stay that way, slowly came back to life himself. The solemn, watchful little ghost was replaced by a boy. He started to bring Silas his treasures, a strangely shaped rock, a hawk's feather, one of his charcoal drawings. He would set them on the small crate beside the cot without a word, offerings laid at the altar of the returned hero. Silas would look at each object, then at the boy, and give a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. For Tom, it was enough. Raoul would appear at the doorway in the evenings, his face weathered and unreadable, his hat in his hands. He would look at Silas, and Silas would look back. "The fences will need mending when the strength returns to you," Raoul would say, his voice a dry rasp. It was his way of saying, "Get well. You are needed." Slowly, agonizingly, the strength did return. The day Silas first sat on the edge of the porch, the sunlight on his face, was a quiet victory for them all. A week later, he took his first unsteady walk to the barn and back, his jaw set, his every step a battle of will over weakness. Ellie watched him from the cabin window, her heart in her throat, but she did not run to help him. She knew he had to do this alone. And then, one morning, the period of convalescence was over. Silas emerged from the cabin dressed for work, his movements still stiff, but with a new purpose in his stride. The time for waiting was done. The time for rebuilding had begun. The world of the homestead became their shared dominion, a canvas on which they painted the story of their new life, not with words, but with labor. They worked side by side, their days a long, silent conversation of shared tasks and mutual reliance. The corral fence, damaged in the fight, was their first project. The work was hard, a rhythm of brute force and careful placement. Silas, his strength not yet fully returned, would use the post-hole digger, his movements measured, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching with the effort of driving the tool into the hard, sun-baked earth. Each thud of the digger was a declaration. I am still here. I am still strong. Ellie would work with him, clearing the loose dirt from the holes, dragging the heavy new posts into position. She would hold them steady, her hands pressed against the rough, splintery wood, while he shoveled the dirt and rocks back in, tamping it down with the heel of his boot until the post stood firm and true. They rarely spoke. There was no need. He would glance at the shovel, and she would bring it to him. She would struggle to lift a post, and his hand would appear, taking the heavier end without a word. Their movements became a kind of dance, a choreography of shared purpose. In the heat of the midday sun, they would stop and share a ladle of cool water from the well, their eyes meeting over the rim, a silent acknowledgement of the work done, and the work yet to do. The laundry, once her solitary chore, became a shared ritual. She would scrub the clothes on the washboard, her knuckles raw, and he would take the heavy, sodden items and wring them out, his powerful hands twisting the water from the fabric with an ease she could never manage. He would stand on the far side of the clothesline, and she would toss the wet shirts and trousers over to him, and he would catch them and pin them fast, until a long, clean line of white and blue snapped and billowed in the constant desert wind, a banner of their quiet, domestic life. They cooked together. She still did most of the work at the hearth, but he took over the heavier tasks. He would chop the wood, split the kindling, and haul the heavy cast-iron pots. He would sit at the table in the evenings, a bowl in his lap, quietly shelling beans or shucking corn, his large, scarred hands moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. They would move around each other in the small, cramped space of the cabin, never bumping, never crossing paths, their bodies attuned to the presence and motion of the other. They became a unit, a small, self-contained world of four. The word family was never spoken. It was not a word that belonged in the vocabulary of broken, solitary people who had been brought together by violence and desperation. It was a word for another world, a world of lighted windows and soft beds and easy laughter, a world none of them had ever truly known. Yet the shape of it was there. It was there in the evenings, when the day's work was done and a quiet peace settled over the homestead. Raoul would sit on the top step of the porch, the sweet, pungent smoke from his pipe curling up into the twilight air. Silas would sit a step below him, sharpening a knife or mending a piece of tack, his presence a silent, solid anchor. Ellie would sit in the doorway, her hands busy with some small mending task, and Tom would play in the dust at their feet, his childish chatter the only sound that broke the comfortable silence. No one commanded this arrangement. No one said, "Let us sit together." They simply gravitated toward one another, drawn by an unspoken need for the quiet comfort of each other's presence. They were a collection of solitary islands that had, through some strange tectonic shift of fate, drifted together to form a new continent. They were a family, not of blood, but of circumstance and choice. A family forged in silence and sealed with shared labor. And in the center of this quiet world, something was changing in Silas. The deep, impenetrable emptiness in his eyes was beginning to recede. It was being replaced by something else, something watchful and warm. He watched Ellie constantly. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was sewing. He watched the way she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist when she was flushed from the heat of the cook fire. He watched the way she spoke to Tom, her voice soft and gentle. He was seeing her, not just as the woman he had saved, but as the woman who had, in turn, saved him. But he never smiled. His face remained a mask of stone, his expression fixed in the hard, unyielding lines of his past. The ghost of a smile might touch his eyes when Tom did something particularly boyish, but it never reached his mouth. The muscles needed for that particular expression seemed to have atrophied from disuse. Until one afternoon. It was a day of brutal, oppressive heat. The air was thick and heavy, and the sun beat down with a physical force. Ellie was carrying 2 heavy buckets of water from the well to the cabin, her arms straining, the wooden yoke digging into her shoulders. The ground was uneven, and she was tired. Her foot caught on an exposed tree root she hadn't seen. She stumbled, tried to catch her balance, and failed. The yoke twisted, and the world became a sudden, chaotic splash of water and flailing limbs. She went down in a heap, the buckets clattering on the hard ground, drenching her from head to toe in an instant. Shocking flood of cool well water. For a moment, she just sat there in the mud puddle she had created, stunned and soaking wet. Her dress was plastered to her skin, her hair was dripping, and the precious water was gone, already sinking into the thirsty earth. The Ellie of a few months ago would have cried in frustration and shame. She would have seen it as another failure, another sign of her own weakness. But this Ellie, the Ellie of the homestead, looked at her dripping hands, at the empty, overturned buckets, at the muddy mess she had made, and a bubble of pure, unadulterated amusement rose up in her chest. She started to laugh. It was not a small, polite titter. It was a full, deep, genuine laugh, a sound of pure, helpless mirth. She laughed at the shock of the cold water, at her own clumsiness, at the sheer absurdity of the moment. She threw her head back and laughed until tears streamed from her eyes, mingling with the well water on her cheeks. It was a sound of freedom, a sound of life, a sound that had not been heard in this place for a very long time. Silas had been walking from the barn. He had seen her fall. He had started forward, his immediate instinct to help her, to fix the problem, but he stopped dead when he heard her laugh. He just stood there, a few yards away, and watched her. And then it happened. It was not a large thing. It did not transform his face. It began as a faint tremor at the corners of his mouth. It was a slow, reluctant yielding of muscles that had been held rigid for a decade. A lifetime of grief and loss and hardness fought against it. But the pure, clear sound of her laughter was a force of nature it could not resist. Slowly, creakily, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years, Silas Boone smiled. It was a small, crooked, unfamiliar thing, but it was real. It reached his eyes, and for the first time, the gray emptiness was completely vanquished, replaced by a light of such warmth and startling tenderness that it was almost painful to look at. The smile changed everything about his face, erasing years of hardship, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been, the man he could still become. Ellie's laughter died in her throat when she saw it. She stared at him, her heart doing a slow, painful flip in her chest. He was still smiling, a look of quiet, profound wonder on his face, as if he were as surprised by it as she was. Their eyes met across the small, muddy space between them, and in that shared, silent moment, A final wall crumbled into dust. He had not just smiled. He had let her in. And in the warm, golden light of that desert afternoon, everything, absolutely everything, had changed. His smile, once it had appeared, did not vanish entirely. It was not a constant presence on his face. Silas Boone was not a man remade overnight into a creature of easy grins. But the memory of it lingered, a permanent shift in the landscape of his features. It was there in the corners of his eyes when he watched Tom chase a lizard in the dust. It was there in the slight softening of his mouth when Ellie handed him a cup of coffee in the cool, pre-dawn light. The impenetrable wall of his past had been breached, not by a battering ram, but by the sound of her laughter, and a little bit of light had gotten in. A new kind of silence grew in the space that smile had created. It was no longer the silence of survival, or the silence of shared trauma. It was an easy, comfortable quiet, filled with the low hum of unspoken affection. They still worked side by side from sunup to sundown, their lives a testament to the relentless demands of the land. But now, their labor was laced with a new, gentle intimacy. Their hands would brush when he passed her a tool. Their eyes would meet across the length of a newly dug row in the garden, holding for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He had started talking, a little. His words were as sparse and carefully chosen as water in a drought, but they were there. He would point to a hawk circling high overhead and say its name. He would comment on the feel of the air, a prediction of rain that always proved true. He told her the story of the gnarled old mesquite tree that stood alone 100 yards from the cabin, how its deep roots were a sign of a hidden water source. Each word was a small, precious gift, a piece of himself he had kept locked away for years. In turn, Ellie found her own voice. She told him stories of her mother, of the songs she used to sing while she baked bread. She described the green, gentle hills of the place she was born, a world away from this harsh, beautiful land of rock and sun. They were stitching their pasts together, not the ugly, violent parts, but the small, quiet pieces that made them who they were. They were building a history together, one story, one shared silence at a time. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long had finally receded into a distant memory. She felt safe here, in a way she had never felt safe in her life. It was a safety that went bone deep, a certainty that the walls of this small, rugged homestead, and the presence of the quiet man who moved within them, were stronger than any threat the outside world could muster. She was no longer a refugee hiding under his coat. She was home. And yet, there was one last ghost, one final, tender bruise deep in her soul that had not yet healed. It was the shame of her past, the knowledge of what she had been intended for, the feeling of being a piece of property, her worth tallied on a saloon ledger. She knew, in her heart, that Silas did not see her that way. His every action, every quiet gesture of respect, told her so. But the poison of that old life still lingered, a faint, bitter taste at the back of her throat. She needed to hear it. She needed to lance the wound herself, to expose it to the clean, dry air of their honest life and know, once and for all, that it held no power over them. The moment came on an evening that seemed made for quiet confessions. The day's work was done. Raoul had eaten with them and had already retired to his small shack, his silhouette a familiar, stooped shape moving slowly across the dusky yard. Tom, exhausted from a long day of boyish adventures, was fast asleep on his cot. A profound peace had settled over the land. Ellie and Silas stood together on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching the sun die. It was a spectacle of breathtaking, violent beauty. The western sky was on fire, a riot of crimson and gold and deep, bruised purple. The light spilled across the landscape, turning the brown earth a rich, rosy red and casting long, sharp shadows that stretched out like fingers. The air was cool and still, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Silas stood beside her, not touching, but so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He was watching the sunset, his face softened by the warm, colored light. The harsh lines of his life momentarily erased. He looked peaceful, and the sight of his peace was a balm to her soul. This was what she wanted for him. This was the gift she wanted to give him. A life free of the storms that had raged both outside and within him. And to do that, she had to be sure she was not a storm herself. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and the faint scent of wild sage. Her heart began a slow, heavy drum against her ribs.
"Silas,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. He did not speak, but his gaze was an invitation, patient and open. She had to force the words out. They were the heaviest things she had ever lifted. She looked down at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her apron. "The night my PA made his bargain," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Abernathy, he wanted me for his wife, but he made it clear what that meant. He was an old man, and I was young. He spoke of it, of what a husband is owed." She looked up, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. "They never touched me. I ran before they could, before the wedding night." She paused, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between them. This was it, the final, festering wound. "I know what men value," she whispered, her voice raw with a shame she thought she had buried. "What a good woman is supposed to be, clean, unspoiled." She took one last, shaky breath, and laid her soul bare. "Do you want a virgin?" The question fell into the immense silence of the evening. The crickets, which had just begun their nightly chorus, seemed to fall silent. The vibrant colors of the sky seemed to dim. The world held its breath with her. She had taken the ugliest, most painful part of her history, the question of her physical worth, the core of her commodification, and placed it, like a sharpened stone, in his hand. He could use it to build with, or he could use it to cut her to the bone. Silas did not answer. He did not move. He simply looked at her, and the gentle peace on his face was replaced by an expression of such profound, aching sorrow that it stole her breath. But the sorrow was not for himself, or for any perceived loss. It was for her. It was for the girl who had been so wounded by the world that she believed this was a question that needed to be asked. He was seeing, in that moment, the full depth of the chains she had been trying to break. He turned his gaze from her face and looked back out at the horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was a molten red line. The silence stretched, pulling taut between them. She felt a cold dread begin to creep into her heart. She had made a mistake. She had brought the ugliness of the outside world into their sanctuary, and it had broken the spell. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, like stones grinding together, thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I've seen what this world does to people. Ellie," he said, his eyes still fixed on the dying light. "I've seen it take and break and burn things until there's nothing left but ash. It takes the good and the bad. It doesn't care about clean. It only cares about what it can use." He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, dark and deep in the twilight, found hers again. "The world tried to use you. It tried to put a price on you, like you were a horse or a sack of flour, and you fought it. You ran. You survived. That's what I see when I look at you." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower, becoming intensely personal, a sound meant only for her. "I don't want a virgin," he said, and the words were a quiet absolution. "I don't want a clean slate, or an unspoiled thing, or any of the words that men like Abernathy use to own something. I want the woman who stood in that doorway with a shotgun in her hands to protect a child. I want the woman who sat by my bed for 4 days and refused to let me die. I want the woman who can find a flower in the middle of all this rock and dust." He took a step closer, closing the small space between them. "I just want you, Ellie, all of you, the parts that are scared, and the parts that are strong, the past that haunts you, and the future we're building. All of it. He lifted his hand, not to touch her face, but to simply hover in the air near her, a gesture of profound respect. The only thing that matters, the only thing I've ever wanted, is your choice. So if you're asking me if I want to make a life with you, to make this place a real home, then the answer has to be yours. If that's a word you say by your own will, with no fear and no debt behind it, his voice grew thick, then your yes is the only thing I need. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally escaped. They were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of release, a warm, cleansing flood that washed away the last of the grime of her old life. He was not just accepting her past. He was honoring her strength. He was not taking, he was asking. He was giving her back the one thing that had been stolen from her own sovereign will. His hand, which had been hovering in the air, slowly lowered and found hers. His fingers, calloused and strong, wrapped around her own, and the touch was not one of possession, but of a deep and grounding partnership. It was a silent vow. He did not ask the question again. He did not need to. She looked up at him, into his steady, honest eyes, and he saw her answer there before she gave it. In the last blazing, blood-red light of the setting sun, she gave a small, simple nod. It was enough. It was everything. Her nod was not the end of a question, but the beginning of an answer that would unfold over all the days to come. The fiery sunset faded, leaving the sky a soft, bruised purple, and in the quiet that followed, a new world was born. It was a world that felt no different on the surface. The same hard-packed earth was under their feet. The same cool desert breeze touched their skin, but was, in its very foundation, irrevocably changed. The unspoken question that had hovered between them for months had been asked and answered, and the space it had occupied was now filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. The next morning, the change was palpable. It was in the way Silas looked at her as she poured his coffee, a steady, open gaze that held no shadows. It was in the way she moved about the cabin, no longer a guest grateful for shelter, but a woman in her own home. The invisible lines of territory that had existed between them, his side of the room, her small space had dissolved. There was no longer his and hers, there was only theirs. She had officially become a person of the ranch, not by a document or a ceremony, but by a simple, profound shift in the gravity of their lives. She was no longer a satellite, held in orbit by his kindness and protection. She was now a twin star, her own light and warmth contributing to the center of their small universe. Life, which had been a series of chores done in partnership, now became a series of projects undertaken as a unit. The first was the chicken coop. It was a ramshackle affair. One wall badly damaged in the fight, the roof leaking in a dozen places. It was a remnant of the violence, a scar on the face of their homestead, and they set about erasing it together. The work was a reflection of their new reality. Silas, with his methodical strength, would pry the broken boards free. The sound of the crowbar groaning against old nails, a rhythmic, percussive song of deconstruction. He taught her how to hold the bar to get the best leverage, his large hand briefly covering hers on the cool iron, his touch now easy and natural. He showed her how to square a new piece of lumber, how to read the grain of the wood, his voice a low, patient rumble against the backdrop of the busy morning. Ellie, in turn, brought her own meticulous care to the task. She would gather the old, bent nails, painstakingly straightening them on a flat rock with a hammer, a small act of thrift that was second nature to her. She was the one who spotted the beginnings of a wasp nest under the eaves, who organized the tools, who ensured the new planks were clean of dust and splinters before Silas nailed them into place. Tom was their constant, cheerful apprentice. He was tasked with the important job of holding the can of nails, which he did with a solemnity befitting a general. He would hand them to Silas one by one, his small face alight with the pride of being included, of being a vital part of the work. He would chatter and ask questions, And Silas, who had once answered him with only grunts and nods, now found the words to explain why one board was better than another, why the nails had to be driven in at an angle. He was not just rebuilding a chicken coop. He was building a world for his boy, a world where questions were welcomed and knowledge was shared. Raoul would watch them sometimes from the edge of his garden, leaning on his hoe, a small, satisfied smile playing on his wrinkled lips. He would watch Silas point something out to Ellie, watch her nod in understanding, watch Tom run between them, a small, happy shuttle weaving their lives together. He saw not just a coop being mended, but a family being built, plank by plank, nail by nail. One afternoon, they were working on the roof, a hot, thankless job under the relentless sun. Silas was perched on the new rafters, his hammer rising and falling with a steady, powerful rhythm. Ellie was on the ground below, sawing new slats to the length he called down to her. It was a partnership of trust and communication. He trusted her cuts to be true, and she trusted his hands on the high beams. She passed a finished slat up to him, and he took it, their fingers brushing. She shielded her eyes from the sun, looking up at him. He was the master of this small world, a man of immense capability and quiet strength, a wave of affection, so strong it was almost playful, washed over her. "You work your crew hard. Boss," she called up, a teasing note in her voice that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks prior. Silas stopped hammering. He looked down at her, his face half in shadow from the brim of his hat. He considered her words, turning the unfamiliar title over in his mind. He looked from her upturned, smiling face to the boy playing nearby, to the sturdy cabin, to the vast, open land that stretched out around them. He looked at all the pieces of this life they were building, a life he had never thought he would have again. When he looked back down at her, his eyes were full of a deep, startling tenderness. The small, crooked smile she had come to cherish touched his lips. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "You're not the crew." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "You're home." The word landed in her heart with a gentle, profound finality. Home. It was not a place, not a building of wood and mud. It was this. It was the feeling of standing in the sun and passing a piece of wood up to the man on the roof. It was the sound of a boy's laughter. It was the knowledge that she was not just welcome here, not just safe here, but that she was an essential, irreplaceable part of the foundation. Without her, it was just a cabin, a barn, a piece of land. With her, it was a home. The days flowed into weeks. The seasons began to turn. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden, mellow light of autumn. The new roof on the chicken coop held firm against the first of the seasonal rains. The mended fences stood strong against the wind. The scars of the past were healing, both on the land and in their hearts. One evening, they were sitting on the porch again, watching another spectacular sunset paint the sky. It had become their ritual, a quiet time at the end of the day to simply be together. Tom was asleep inside. Raoul was a distant figure, walking the perimeter of his garden. It was just the two of them. Ellie looked at Silas. He was not looking at the sky, but at her, with that same quiet wonder she had seen the day he first smiled. The love she felt for him was a calm, deep river, a current that ran through every part of her. It was a love born not of flowery words or grand passions, but of shared silence, of mutual respect, of 1,000 small, ordinary acts of care. She thought back to the beginning, to the terrified girl cowering in the corner of a dirty train car. She remembered the fear, the desperation, the feeling of being a hunted animal with nowhere left to run. And she remembered the tall, silent man who had offered her the only thing he had a shadow to hide in. He had been her shelter from the storm. Now, he was her sunlight. He was the firm ground beneath her feet, the roof over her head, the steady, constant beat of her own heart. He was everything. In his shadow, she had not been diminished. She had been allowed to grow. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, a voice she never knew she could use, a home she never knew she could have. She reached out and laid her hand on his, and his fingers closed around hers, a familiar, comforting weight. Once, she had only asked to hide under his coat. Now, looking at the man beside her and the life that stretched out before them, bright and full of promise under the vast western sky, she knew she would spend the rest of her life living in the shelter of his love. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your city or country and your thoughts on Ellie and Silas's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and if you truly enjoyed it, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.